Hey, Leslie, thank you for coming in today. You have this marvelous background, very diverse, and you're thinking, awesome talent and all these global contributions. So thank you for coming in and sharing your experiences with my audience.
Thank you so much. It's truly an honor for me to get to have any time with you.
So I'm just going to turn up my volume a little bit here. So, Leslie, I always start these interviews with these questions, and this one question in particular, what were the inflection points in your life that made you who you are today, this wonderful person? And it could have been when you're 2 or 3 years old, inside, outside the family. It could have been both opportunities and challenges. But what were those things that really shaped you to who you are?
That's a great question. My first memory around age 4 was the felt experience of standing on the pillows in my family room. So I stacked them up so it seemed like a mountain to me, and singing. And I think there were people around, I'm remembering. And just the feeling of singing in my body is really my first memory. And I kind of organized my whole life around wanting to pursue what I thought to define as music, because societally, if you're really into singing, typically you end up in some capacity of performance and music. So that was a giant inflection point for me. I also think that, like many people, I probably am a very highly sensitive person. So anything I couldn't organize in my life rationally and put into a sock drawer or sort of indexed format, like emotions, I needed a place to organize that for myself. So I became a songwriter, and I would kind of write out whatever I was feeling. And I have a lot of affinity for language. And to me, sound and lyric really came together naturally. So I spent a lot of time writing and performing. But I think that another inflection point for me, fast forward many years as a performer, playing around the world, singing jazz standards, writing my own music, was sort of an exhaustion I felt from this type of being on a stage and having an audience. I felt like there was something more about voice that we hadn't really formally recognized. Another inflection point for me was I began to start teaching voice. I went to university, Berklee College of Music, and studied guitar primarily and voice as well. But it wasn't really in music school that I think I really learned, but through experience. And I had one teacher particularly who taught me in traditional Rajasthani singing, which was very much about felt experience. And instead of doing more, further, faster, he would have me just sing one note for like 15 minutes a day. That was my year-long practice. So that was a big inflection point for me, just coming to a kind of meditative state. With music, and not knowing then, but what happens in a kind of consistent, coherent voice meditation is that there's a lot of crosstalk that happens between the left and the right hemispheres of the brain. So I was teaching voice. That's been another massive inflection point for me, and I began to realize that voice was not just this generative mechanism for speech, larynx, pharynx, glottis, but something happening more on a system level. I worked with high security prisoners, which was like another massive inflection point. Just profound experience of seeing the power of transformation that can happen when people access their voice. So working with an array of people, from like TED speakers and Eurovision winners to like people in late stages of disease, and noticing that there was like a common physics happening with voice that we hadn't understood yet. And then another inflection point was kind of presenting voice as a tool for math, or an inroad for more technological discovery, to Ray Kurzweil, who then funded my longer term research and path of describing what is deep voice, not as sound output, but an internal coordination system. And then I'd say the last inflection point is kind of putting a bunch of papers together that show that voice emerged in our earliest shared ancestor that was a relative of the lungfish about 400 million years ago. proto-language at its oldest is about 2.5 million, so it's said, and language is just 150,000. So then if language is about 0.05% of all of voice history, what was it doing for 400 million years? And that allowed me to put together a really cool multidisciplinary team of advisors, and that's been my last inflection point. And I'm just really in love with this journey, this curious, driven journey.
Okay, so let's go back to the very beginning. What inspired you to have an interest in music? And was it your parents or brothers and sisters or an uncle or you were, is it a family thing, or are you an outlier in the family?
I think it's a family thing for sure on both sides of my family. My grandfather was, his parents immigrated to the U.S. from Eastern Europe, and his father died in a factory as a factory worker, and he was orphaned. And music sort of like saved his life, he said. But he became an engineer and also a recording artist, and he made a record on RCA Records in like years ago. So he was really passionate about voice and singing and playing guitar. And then on my mom's side of the family, everyone was pretty theatrical and artistic. So somewhere between the two, and I think for me too, when I was younger, my dad is very mathematical and he's an accountant and a lawyer, and he's a pretty intense guy. And so I felt like my creativity was, I didn't think that I could really approach engineering and math because it felt so scary because he was so intense. But I realized later that there's an incredible connection between composition and imagination and invention and engineering. And I feel like I'm climbing more into my dad's side of the family now, which are more engineering people and who still love, vibrational propagation. Like my grandfather was creating some of the first tubes for RCA computation and stuff like this, but also music. So I just think that there's much more of a left and right brain integration for all people than we often recognize. I don't think artistry is that far a reach for most of us, but it's just not something that we sometimes are encouraged to access.
I see. So there's sort of this theme of music or entertainment and things like this and artistry in your family. When did you first pick up a guitar?
Oh my God, that's such a great question. Okay, I'll try to give you the condensed version because I'm already giving you too long form. But I went to summer camp when I was a girl, and that was like my time in nature. That was just so contrasting to being in an urban environment. It was so free and liberating. And we were on a camp out, and one of the counselors came in the middle of the woods and played guitar for us in front of the fire. And he played a Cat Stevens song, Father and Son, and it moved me so much. And like 2 months later, I woke up in the middle of the night with one of the lyrics of this song. And I said, I have to play guitar. And I was fortunate enough that my dad bought me like a pretty inexpensive guitar. And I was so into it. And, I played for 35 years.
And so that was an abiding interest when you were in high school, and then you went to the Berklee school, which is a really famous school. How did you get in? Did you do an application? How did that process work? Because people may not realize that it's hard to get into that kind of school. It's one of the top schools, right?
They say it is. I knew that it was the only school I wanted to go to when I was 18. And I had recorded a couple of records already.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I had this one demo tape called Songs I Won't Like in 10 Years. And my dad always tells this funny story because he like copywrote them because like back in the day, he thought that's what he should do or something. And he was looking at the tape name and it was saying songs that I won't care about in 5 years or whatever. And he was like, why am I copywriting these songs? But I sent that demo to Berklee, and I had an interview with the president who no longer is around, Larry Burke. And then I was able to get in, and I had a hard time relating to a lot of the classes because I was so self-taught. And I always remember that Joni Mitchell supposedly learned how to play guitar by going out into nature And she didn't know how to tune her strings, so she would just tune them to the sounds of the birds, and that's how she started to write. So my own kind of Morse code of music was vastly different than, you know, the theory of music. But since I've really jumped into the profundity of music, I look at it as a very motile math. So
I see. So you're indicating you're self-taught, and then there'd be some friction, right? Or some challenges you'd feel, because this is a programmatic approach. And did you feel tension and conflict, you know, because it's a different process, right? And how long did it take you to acclimatize to this new process? And what was that atmosphere like at Berklee? Did you find it was encouraging, or do you find that it was kind of more stoic and traditional, and it took some time to sort of integrate into that mentality? And has that school changed, do you know, in their approach?
oh, these are like, oh my gosh, Stephen, we could do a whole book on Berklee College of Music and its climate over the last decade. Yeah, when I went to Berklee, there were literally 3% women. That's it.
3%. Wow.
Yeah, and like 2 guitarists. And I majored in guitar because
Right.
everybody assumed I was a singer because I'm a woman. So, you know, and this is kind of crazy, maybe TMI, but I shaved off all my hair because I didn't even want to be gender associated. I mean, I was obviously like connected to being a woman, but I didn't want that to be the first thing people thought when they heard me play or saw me play. So I think I was grappling I think when anyone's 18, if they have the chance to go to college and they take it, it's a giant moment of finding ourselves anyway. So there's all that going on. And I was lucky when I was there. It was like an incredible time. There were so many jazz musicians, many who I keep in touch with now. And I knocked on the door of a teacher of avant-garde jazz, and you had to have the topmost technical ratings to get into his ensemble. And I didn't even have a rating. But what I did have when I was younger, which I wish I still had now, which was a lot of collagen that maybe translated into audacity. So I knocked on his door and I said, you know what? I know I can sing with your avant-garde ensemble. And there wasn't even a place for singer. Like in the ensemble, they didn't even have a singer as a role. And he looked at me and he was like, all right, kid, come on Tuesday at 2 and we'll see what you do. And I came. And, you know, the way this guy operated is he'd turn off all the lights in this little ensemble room. I mean, it was 1995. You could get away with that probably. And all the musicians would play. It was like in the dark and it was so free. And I would just start singing and speaking poetry. And we would go on these beautiful sonic journeys together. And then before long, he would invite me to come to his jazz show. I ended up staying in that ensemble the whole time I was at Berklee. It was avant-garde. And then I would go to his jazz shows in Boston and he would throw me the mic. And I was like, I think when I was younger, it was too difficult in that environment to be a woman. So I was very much like suspended in my childlike naivete. And it was easier to interact as a child. And I think that that's valuable, but I think that now there's a little bit more of a equal, you know, ratio of all kinds of people at Berklee, women and men. There are many more women in general in the industry who, you know, when I was performing, there were like 1 or 2 solo songwriting women, and I would always get boxed into them. And it wasn't cool back then to be unique or not just like a beautiful physical aesthetic. And I always was challenged with the fact that if I identify as an instrument, am I getting more attention being a singer than I would if I was a drummer? So I think I was struggling a lot with that as a performer. And I think that some of the most successful female performers now are the ones who say, you know, my brand is just being so deeply connected to my ever-changing self. And I think that's a challenge. And it's unfortunate that being connected to something as exponential as music would somehow limit us into this archetype of performer. And that was something I really wrestled with, which I think led me to understanding, wow, voice is doing much more than providing entertainment for the elite.
So in Berkeley, just to kind of get a sense of the culture, did you have people who were kind of more loners, and then you had people who sort of integrated? Do you have people who were so creative that they were an outlier just in their creativity? Did you have what was there this kind of spectrum that you would see there?
Oh my God, yeah. There were some drummers, and some years ago, so I'm not going to try to recall everyone's names, but there were some musicians who were so above and beyond. And you would just they would be performing and you just go see them, and they were students. And then there were groups that would form. I was really fortunate to form with a group of profound musicians, and many of my colleagues are still living and thriving as performing musicians to this day. Many, many. In fact, my drummer at Berklee is now the drummer for Jack Black's band in LA. And he
Oh,
does
wow. Yeah.
music for Bob's Burgers, which is like a show. So, and then there were people who were I remember my first roommates, they were like the other two girls at Berklee. We lived in a dorm. And one of them was, there were a lot of people from around the world. So she didn't speak much English. And, she was very shy. And her idea of being a musician was like being a pop star. And then my other roommate was just an incredibly technical guitar player. And I think that especially in that school, at that point, there was such a focus on what do you do with music? And there were fewer options. And there are more options now. And I think Berklee is recognizing that. And not only are there more options, but like you say, with your S10 technologies, there's more of a convergence of these options. Like performance is not just performance, and therapy is not just therapy in music. They are connected. So I think we're realizing the multidisciplinary nature of all things. And the music industry is one of the most historically siloed industries to a detrimental, I think, in a detrimental capacity. And so, and that's too bad, because music is one of the most integrated, convergent things throughout the world.
So would you say that, so you're a singer, but you're also technically proficient, and guitar was, your soul in essence, right? You could express yourself through almost like a part of your body. And would you say that your orientation on the guitar side was more on the technical, or was it more on being fluid and more jazz-like, and so was it more free form, or was it more technical?
I would say both. Even though I would have never imagined, if you told me at age 15, I used to sleep with my guitar every night, that I would not be playing guitar. Like, to me, music is now my engineering project. Like, it's fully translated into that. But I spend a lot of time studying with really incredible guitar teachers. One of the most amazing, I think, jazz guitarists living is a guy named Bill Frisell. And he is oftentimes slow, but exploratory. And a lot of guitar, and his teacher was my teacher for a while. And a lot of guitarists, especially back then when it was limited to this singer-songwriter kind of thing, it was like you play the first 3 frets and nothing beyond. And if you're playing the first 3 frets of a guitar and you're playing these chord shapes, you're actually borrowing from hundreds of keys. Well, there aren't hundreds of keys, but many keys. And so I really, I wanted to be able to play throughout the whole neck. But for me, a lot of guitarists would take very technical formulas of understanding how to play through the neck. And I would do that too. But I was really interested in these shape-based configurations and this relationship between the left hand and the right hand. So I had kind of my own technique too, but I've also taught guitar as well. The guitar is very unique because with piano, you can kind of see how everything is shaped geometrically in front of you. Like, it's pretty easy to see whole steps, half steps, how things modulate and, but with guitar, it's like everything's down below you in a way. And you're kind of understanding this relationship of tuning between the strings of fifths and fourths. So, and for me too, it's a lot about dexterity. I think it just, even in sports, there's some players who are really swift and some are more pragmatic. And I think for me, I always wanted that swift, on the guitar. But I think where I was slower with my physical technique there, the polyrhythmic expression of my voice and lyrics would just fit so well like peanut butter and jelly together. And that's something that I think is so interesting even in computation, is the relationship of numbers and nodes and scales and the kind of polyrhythm of everything. And I think a lot of musical thinking translates very beautifully into our technology.
Okay, so you're at Berklee. It's a really interesting experience. It's a growth experience because you're meeting such diverse communities. It really expands your thinking as well, right? Because you're meeting so many different people from different areas and their interpretation of music and singing and instrumentation and all of that is it's a universe you can play with. So you graduate, and then what did you do?
Yeah, well, fast forward a few years of some exploration of where do I want to be to make music, from like urban environments to like deep in the woods under stars, being like, no, music belongs to I only want to play for the stars in the sky, to like performing on stage. I had a booking agent, a woman heard me perform at a festival and booked, wanted to start booking me. So I ended up performing sometimes like 300 shows a year as a kind of underground indie artist. And I would drive around in my car and show up at this venue or this university or sometimes this theater. And I did that until I said, I think I want to explore Europe. And then I ended up doing that in Europe for another decade. And so I was sort of just doing that. And I would also perform the music of like jazz legends like Billie Holiday. I loved to listen to her phrasing. I mean, she has like otherworldly phrasing. So I would just drive around. This is kind of before cell phones. Late at night from one venue to another, like driving from like Austin to New Orleans in a night or something, and listen to Billie Holiday and just rewind and repeat. And I don't know, I know that you grew up in a way where you were very passionate about reading. And like, I remember you telling me about encyclopedias in your house. And if you would ever find excerpts, you just go back and read over again and again because of the way they were organized. But that's sort of what I did with Billie Holiday's work. So I did that for a very long time while I was also teaching voice at universities or other places or individually, independently. And I did some residencies in countries doing art residencies where I would interact with the artists of that place, like in Denmark and in Bermuda, and put together projects. So that was sort of my thing. It was like, where in the world is there money for art? I'm going there.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of kind of interesting. You're sort of part of this music in residence program, and there's something about there was a reporting in the Royal Gazette about what you were doing, and you self-offered, things about when you were working in Europe, right? And musical resident in Copenhagen, I think, via the Danish Art Council, and public streaming catalogs, right? And Sonic Zen Records, and some of the things that you're doing there when smart girls do stupid things, and then Young Coconut Water, right?
Yes.
And Berklee, Valencia social posts about that, Cupcakes and Radishes, and let's see here, voiceovers at studio. You've done YouTube things as well, of course. And I'm just kind of walking us through to where you are today. And you're clearly into things like yoga and breath work. Yeah. And so you've talked about that. Sound healing sessions of voice methodology, therapeutic voice performance technique. Luna magazine did something on you, I think, right, as well. And The Well. And then there's Glasgow in your background, right? First person blurb. I'm just thinking here, Bermuda and Denmark, which you mentioned. how did you, so you mentioned then getting into more of the technical side. How did that journey get you into the, when I say technical from a computational side, how did you get into the technical side? What was that entry like? And
It's
who
so
initiated that
interesting.
journey?
So interesting you're referencing so much of who I've been, because I like literally could listen to any record and as an observer, like I think we can live many lives in a life, and I do see the continuity in all of it, but it's like it's so like in my past I'm like, oh yeah, wait, I did do this thing at Sonic Zen Records, like so I think that I've always been a multidisciplinarian lyrically. Like I would reach into so many different areas to find the words that I felt were most living. And sometimes those were in academies, the papers that scientists would write that would live this lonely existence tucked away somewhere. I would find these beautiful words. And I was really interested too in like, what did it mean to be able to have consistent performance and availability in my work? So I took on these practices to be able to show up consistently for others and for myself. And some of those tools were both helpful in how I understood what voice was and also in the things that I could lend individual people. And along the way, when I began to realize, there's something going on in the voice that we haven't recognized. And I know that we have this, potential singularity that we're heading toward. And most of our AI, when it comes to voice, we're thinking language, we're thinking output. But there's something going on in this internal system that's coordinating at scale. And, just like the heart was recognized as a pump for blood for like 400 years before being formally understood as part of a cardiovascular system. When we first defined voice anatomy, what was important was to like speak like the king. And so voice was described as generative mechanisms for speech. But actually to be a voicer, you don't even need pharynx, larynx, or glottis. The only things biology mandates you have are nested cavities, some sort of cylinder shape, lungs, you don't even need two, just one's fine, and the ability to take air in. You don't even need to exhale it like whales and dolphins. You can circulate it. In fact, you may have a better voice if you're not exhaling after all. And it began even before we had tympanic hearing or the real ability to see in these dark, brackish waters. And what began to fascinate me was, how are we still feeling voice? How is it still a way that we're locating where we are when we speak that has nothing to do with what we're saying? And what I've realized in working with so many people, especially the public speaker performer types, they would come to me and their issue with voice was really this mental construct they had that their voice was their identity of ego. Like, they had to come to a place of realizing they were feeling voice when they were using it, not externally thinking or presenting voice. And the feeling I would get when I would write music or really like connect to the beauty of what voice could do inside my body sometimes did not match up to the experience of being kind of dissociated, performing and having to deal with this external perception of voice. And I saw that there was like a mismatch between these things. And at the same time, once I got anybody, whether they were literally in late stage cancer or prepping for a big talk as a public speaker, to feel their voice just the way a baby feels. Like if you want a great voice teacher, look at a baby. They will take, days, if not weeks, to just feel, but that's like full entertainment for them until it becomes normalized. So I wanted to understand, so often music and art and even the things I'm interested in are considered on the fringe. They have not been quantitatively measured. And so I wanted to evaluate, what are the quantitative metrics we're doing to look at voice beyond correlation? And I knew that voice had something that math and geometry had, and that we needed more examples of high fidelity systems to train our context windows, our context length. And that if we were getting on this Noah's Ark of human computer emergence, that we needed this root system of voice on board because it provided what I call bio-spatial intelligence, something internally that mirrors and models internal state. And it's our most broadband agentic signal system. And it evolved just like computation. I mean, it's literally proto-computation. So I thought from my experience, my artistic experience of physical work with so many voices, that there was something here we could translate. And the greatest part about it is I couldn't do it alone. Everything else I had done, I could do alone. I could perform alone. I could book tours alone. I could move alone. I cannot do this project alone. So it's a great challenge for me.
Yeah. So, but what got you into this deep sort of interest in voice and the mechanism of voice? Was it just a creation on your part, or was it interfacing with somebody and helping them, or what shaped you to start researching this area at the very beginning? What inspired you initially to? Was it internally? Internally?
It reminds me of a quote in this I have in my notes. Let's see if I can find it. Okay, Richard Watson. Do you know him?
No, go ahead.
He's a theorist, computer science, evolutionary thinker. And I was listening to an interview he had with Josh Bongard, who's a roboticist. And he described that maybe it isn't natural selection that drives us forward, but this desire to know. And he said that we have this deeply vulnerable, this desire to have deeply vulnerable mutual knowing, the wanting to know. And for me, I think at the core of my interest in music was that it fed my curiosity, and and that naturally just evolved. I got to work with a scientist who did National Geographic deep sea exploration, and realizing the way he was thinking and scientific thinking, and that I could do that too. I just hadn't realized I can do this as well. And I think that every person, at the core of it, the core of this unique moment in time, where we spend literally 1/4 of the year asleep, and no one's really talking about that. We have 9 months a year on some level. Well, maybe you don't, Stephen, because I know that you are a masterful, efficient creator. But, we have a very limited amount of time. And I think in this time, we want to have reciprocal purpose. I didn't want to just keep creating art, which I know is extremely impactful, but I also know a very small percentage of people have a profound impact in that in that field. And firstly, that's a big problem already. I think in a lot of art markets, there's a great amount of taking advantage of the curious student who will pay lots of money to go to school, and et cetera. And there's very little opportunity in the professional world. What do we do with art? We know that it's at the core of what makes the feeling of our fabric of humanity. And yet we have very limited roles for some of these things. So I thought, what can I do in my limited time here? And unfortunately, I'm a really big thinker. I sometimes wish, when I first started thinking about what we could invent with voice, Ray Kurzweil would hear me out. He's so kind. He never said, that's ludicrous thinking. He'd say, when is that going to be relevant? And I'd say, 4,000. And he'd say, can you get a little closer to now? So I think I always like to strengthen my weaknesses. And I don't know if that's always the best approach, because I think some of the greatest people just keep strengthening their strengths. And I think for me, I'm a holistic network thinker. So I see, okay, creating something that's relevant now is scary. It's much easier to write a bunch of music that in 400 years people might like, or 100 years ago might have been hip in the Victorian era. But to create something with the pressure of it needing to happen in the next 5-10 years, that's challenging. And I've always been kind of a future thinker. So I think that actually everything that happened before now was for this moment. And we don't always know the point we're going to get to. And that's the great thing about life.
So you, I'm sort of looking at this from a systems point of view, right? And you have this early interest in music and exploration and curiosity and creativity, and you slept with your guitar. I mean, you were so enamored with the expression that you could do with the guitar, but you're also voice and singing, and you get into Berklee, and it's a really interesting environment for you because you're unique in that environment. There's a scarcity in what you represent in that environment, and you can explore even further. You get a better sense of your identity within that environment because of your uniqueness, but then you get these explore all of the other kind of uniqueness that's out there, and the diversity and the ranges of exploration of creativity and thinking. You then continue to expand the artistic side, the technical side, but also more the universal cosmic kind of side of you, right? Because you're embracing all of totality of sort of the 360 view of the universe, and you're embracing all of it. What I'm hearing then is that expansion then continues beyond, but synergistic with your father, who had this kind of more technical kind of underpinning, coming back, some of those roots coming back, where there's a formality and a rigidity in this, but there was also a precision. And what I'm hearing is that all of that creativity, all of that other aspects you explored, you start exploring the precision that comes from science, but also the exploration of the unknown, and that got you interested in the application of this into voice-driven internal physiological aspects, and even getting a patent in this area, and then driving this into saying, hey, this could be a company because of all of this intersection that has occurred. How did Kurzweil is very difficult sometimes to get to. How did that manifest, that intersection between what you're doing and, because he lives in a particular space, right? And his community, and how did your space intersect with his space? How did that occur?
That's a great question. I first just wanted to refine a question you asked, which was, how did I get from music to this engineering of voice? And I think that also, after working with like 1,000 voices, we started to realize that we got voice wrong. We literally have voice wrong. Even public speaking teachers, like, we don't know what voice is still. We're going to Mars and we're doing all these wonderful, I call it geospatial, activities, but we're missing this repository of data. That was the thing. Oh my God, we're missing a repository of data. I know I can't get all the information on my own, but I do know I'm really good at putting groups together. I've been doing it musically in the arts for a long time, and even in governance, creating country supported residence programs in the arts. And I know we can find out more about this. I think there's a lot more utility that voice has. And I think we don't know about internal state. And we think about the trilemma, the governance that you described, trilemma, the three factors that are like influencing. I think I have them written down somewhere that you describe. I think that if our governance in our physical systems are thinking so much about external performance metrics of safety, like biology mandates we have an internal state and an external state. Our technology is not mandating that right now. I think we have a lot more. I'm always interested in bio-inspiration, bio-translation. Nature has been a massive influence for me because nature is music. So there's that. Ray was the first person I ever heard speak, not even live, who helped me solve for a duality I had not been able to crack. I don't love having dualities. I don't know about you, but if I think something is right or wrong, it really bothers me. I think of things spectrally. There's not just a 1 and a 0 to everything. I'm a more analog thinker, I guess. But I couldn't figure out how the nature of music was going to translate into this high-tech future. because every time I plugged in with a lot of wires and cords and electronics, something was always lost. And Ray was the first person who said, yeah, this cell phone is an extension of your neocortex because you didn't have any more architectural room in here. And I thought, oh my God, if anything exists, it has to be nature. That was something he just helped me click something together or put something together. And I loved that he said, really we have this potential promise or peril in our future. It depends on how we use technology. And that really hit me because I've heard some of the greatest business thinkers say that, okay, top companies, they always reduce friction. Like Uber solved for transport friction, Google solved for search friction. But one of the biggest frictions we have, and it's becoming more outspoken, is this friction of our future. Are we going to be building systems that support peril or promise, not only for our humanity, but our interaction between humanity and technology? And I thought, wow, deep voice, it could potentially support safe parameters because voice has scaled safely with intelligence for 400 million years. And we can learn how it did that. And we can maybe build some low order parameters for our internal state systems so that they can coordinate on multi-scale, just like voice does, because voice is encoding internal state information across every major body system with multi-scale precision. So if we can see how that works, we can then organize that kind of intelligence into our physical systems. And that could be a giant platform that touches a lot of your S10 technologies. So that's where I was coming from. And I simply wrote Ray an email. I don't know how I found his email address. I thought, wow, this guy is like, I wrote a book because I write books too. That's something I do for my livelihood. I write books for other people. And I write my own books. But I wrote this one book. I was like, no one's going to ever read this book except maybe Kurzweil would like it. I was like, he's the only person who might like this book. So I wrote him, I think I sent a copy and I said, hey, I think you're the only person who might like this book I wrote. It was a very abstract book on the chromosomic history of the X and Y chromosome over 150,000 years. And Ray wrote back because I said I was a musician. He said my dad was a musician. And Ray's like one of the most humanitarian people I've ever met. People think he's so focused on technology. He's one of the most human-centered people I've ever met. And then I wrote him back. He didn't write me back. And then like a year and a half later, I have these giant notebook. It's like 25 inches by, it's really big. And sometimes when I really need big change in my life, I'll write on this big notebook. And I wrote in the middle of it, Ray Kurzweil. I didn't know why. It was like the last week of the year in 2020. We were in the middle of the pandemic. It's probably because we were in the middle of the pandemic that when I wrote Ray, I accidentally, instead of sending it to email, I texted it via email and he responded. And he was like, because I was like, do you think there's any way we could have a conversation? And he wrote back and he said, I'd have a conversation with you. And he could feel what he called like the poetry of my interest. And I think that he was one of those people that create initial investment because of who you are and their belief in who you are. So that was extremely generous of him. And I've, been working very arduously ever since.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable. I mean, and he invested, right? Okay, so describe your company because you've got patents on your work, and then describe your company and what it does.
Yeah, well,
and you got Ray Kurzweil as an investor. So.
It's true, and the people who are my advisors are pretty profound in a handful of disciplines that are all relevant to understanding voice, not as sound or language, but as internal state signaling. That is agentic, really. It's like it's agentic signal systems. And, it's voice solved for biology, I believe. A lot of the same issues AI is trying to solve for now. Simultaneous input, output, cross-domain reasoning. And before I even actually knew what we were going to build, I knew that I wanted to understand voice as a system. So whatever product we put at the end of it needed to be quantitative and rigorous and valuable. So it's interesting because like for many years I didn't talk about it because I was patenting it. And when you're an artist, you talk about everything like years before it happened. And so this was very different. Like I had my best friends sign NDAs before I showed them. And one of the things I've really valued in getting to meet you, Stephen, is that you are really about sharing your wealth of knowledge. After I met you in person, literally, I felt like I got smarter just by being in your presence. And I know other people have felt that too. And that's like an amazing gift that comes from like having a generous heart. And maybe I'm just projecting belief in yourself and where you are in your life. But for a long time, I was scared because the amount of funding that Technevox is going to need is far more substantial than a friends and family investment. We'll just call that what, Ray provided. And the funding journey for individual people who are not directly associated or inside of a university system or getting non-diluted NIH funds or getting like foundational funding, that's a whole subject I'd love to talk about. So I think a lot of people struggle with that. And I actually was thinking about that this morning. And I was thinking that I wrote this down, that some of the most important technology the next decade may be blocked not by science, but by capital formats that no longer fit foundational innovation. So Technevox is a long horizon initiative, and it spans a lot of different areas. And the first area that it touches is in internal medicine. And, I didn't talk about this for a long time, and I'm still creating the funding strategies for it. So I still don't go too much into detail, but I patented a modality of internal imaging that uses just voice as the excitation source. So currently when you get imaging, whether it's nuclear or whatever it is, it's using external stimulation to have a response from the body, exogenous. But voice is an internal system that is naturally organized inside of our body, so that if we can find a way to image with voice, we may see pre-disease earlier than other imaging modalities, because the way that these signals are organizing inside of tissues, hard and soft, reveal information about the state of our health, perhaps before we can see those physical structural changes. So there's a whole engineering journey on that. And I've been very thankful to have some wonderful engineers like Risto Mikulanian, who created Cognizant AI's, a lot of hit their technology, and who is a professor at University of Texas, Austin, and who has been one of the biggest people in evolutionary computation. And I've been able to work with Gerard Schuster, who's also a pretty hands-on advisor. He's a pioneer of seismic interferometry, because the way I think of voice is very similar to seismology, which oftentimes you'll have a detonation of tons, and it will create a signal into the earth, and the signal you get back is measured, and then a seismogram or an image is revealed. And so I think of voice as internal detonation that happens on average 20,000 times a day. Especially probably for me, it's even more, but on average globally, if we're looking at syllables, we speak about 20,000 of these a day. That's 20,000 opportunities to measure a signal inside of potentially craniofacial or pulmonary regions to get information about hard and soft tissues, to be able to see, screen, rehab, and monitor conditions, and potentially even conditions that are neurodegenerative. Right now, we're able to, for example, take measurements of our blood sugar. We see, I eat this, not very good for my blood sugar. Right now, we don't have a way to continually monitor cerebrospinal fluid, which we already know is a biomarker for neurodegenerative diseases from MS, Parkinson, etc. So if we start to understand voice as a means for exciting our system internally, and not just exciting, but also encoding bidirectionally. It excites our system in turn shapes the voice. This happens simultaneously. And throughout time, the animals that selected for voice evolution, they show the greatest neural complexity, adaptive behavior, sensory integration, coordination, and my favorite, propensity for play. So these are things that I think are very important as our physical systems evolve. So beyond medicine, And within medicine, by the way, we can use voice as a way to update our digital twins. We can use voice as potentially a way to augment our bioengineered tissues, because they're going to have to be resilient inside of a body that has signals propagating through it all the time. And then outside, we have deep security, ways that we can validate our identification, not just by some sort of correlative statistic, because just to sidetrack, though we thought voice was language for a long time, in the last 10 years, there's been a 900% increase in the amount of papers that show voice as a diagnostic for conditions across every major body system, from atrial fibrillation to kidney disease to virus. So these are all correlative biomarkers. But to quote Kimberly Powell, who's the vice president of health at NVIDIA, she talks about biological IP. This isn't codification of via biomarkers or, sort of any kind of labeling, but actually learning what the intelligence of our biological systems are doing. So this is where the biotranslation piece comes in. We look so far outside of ourselves often, termites, to understand swarms and how that can impact our computation senses in physical systems. But we have this entire swarm of voice that operates in a hive-like capacity every time we're speaking that we haven't even looked at yet. So I'm interested in energy efficiency, and I think that, complex science has been doing that naturally. So when it comes to robotics, anything from autonomous systems to our humanoids, we don't really have an internal state, not only for systems with voice, because that would be helpful, because I've heard some of the living robots and I've heard their voices, and it sounds like someone took a recording and put it in their voice and it's in one location. Like, voice doesn't work like that. It's a composite of oscillatory signals that are happening largely in every nested cavity in the body, specifically ones that are collagen rich and smooth in our high fidelity system spaces. So yeah, there's a lot to do, and I have a lot to learn. And I have a lot of weaknesses to strengthen and a lot of strengths to believe in. So that's the journey.
So we're down to about the last couple of minutes, and because I've got to set up for another interview. I'm doing 6 interviews today, back to back. So,
Oh my gosh.
And in the next couple of minutes, can you do an ask or what's your recommendation to the audience, and what questions you want to leave the audience?
Okay. On an experiential level for your audience, even if they may think it's abstract and out there, I'd love them to take a couple of their fingers, because fingers are some of the most sensitive places, our fingertips, and they can put them on like C1, C2, the back of their occiput, the back of their spine, right around where the axis atlas is. And they could just take a deep breath in and kind of smile and hum and just feel how their voice is creating vibration in their body. So it would be something like this. And just they can notice and feel that their voice is actually like an excitation system and not just output. So there's that. And then I guess the other ask, depending on who's listening, is to consider that we're moving into a future where some of the most important discoveries, I think, don't fit anymore into the quick ROI turnaround. What are you going to get from this in the next 5 months, or just the linear, like, what's the product at the end? We have to move away from this profit is win at all costs and profit is gold kind of strategy. And think more about what is the process of our discovery? How can we do more with the resources we have, especially the ones that are closest to ourselves? And that biology mandates that life is embodied. So if we're thinking about physical systems, we should look at some of the intelligence of biology's embodiment beyond just what Josh Bongard called, and I've called before too, this head on a stick. Our intelligence is just not only audio cognizant, neurolinguistic, and cognitive. It exists through the whole physical state, and there's a lot of intelligence in this complexity, and modeling it is really important.
Wow, I mean, that could be your recommendations and questions could be like 10 podcasts. Leslie, that was amazing. That's an amazing journey you've taken us on from your early, sort of creative moments and how that matured in different ways and then became so multidimensional. It's like an endless matrix multiplication happening in high dimensionality space. I mean, it's just incredible. I can see now more, even though I only see a tiny fragment, but I can see more now the potential of your work of this, voice-driven internal physiological imaging. But it's a 360 universal, unbounded Hilbert space kind of physiological imaging, right? It has no boundaries. Thank you we definitely have to do more of these. Just amazing time. Thank you for sharing with my audience. And I encourage my audience to support your work. It's just amazing what you're doing. So
thank you so much. Honestly, the true gratitude is mine. Your work is so profound, and I consider you a mentor and a role model. And I just thank you so much for your work in the world, and may our conversations continue. Thank you.
Absolutely. And in fact, you were on the stage at AI for Good as well, and they're very selective. So thank you again for taking the time and sharing so much with our audience, and blessings to you. So
thanks. Likewise. All right. Take care. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.